Welcome to Designing Hollywood podcast show. I'm your host, Phillip Boutté Jr. A special thank you to our sponsor, Universal Costumes Department, for their continued support of the show.
Here we are at Universal's Costume Department main warehouse, where everything is possible. This fabulous jewelry room where you can find pearls, you can find jewelry when we want to accessorize. This is the tie wall. Look at what this selection is. Any color you want, any style you want, anything that you need to dress your actors going to a party, a wedding, where you could find armor, post-apocalyptic. Universal has a great selection to get pieces to help create great new costumes. Brought to you by Universal Studios.
Designing Hollywood is dedicated to all things movies and celebrates the talented industry professionals from producers, cinematographers, and costume designers. The show covers all high-profile industry professionals who contribute to the magic of Hollywood, diving deep into the heart of the movie industry, exploring the artistry, craftsmanship, and stories behind the scenes that bring our favorite films to life. Our guest today is a professional award-winning artist with over 40 years experience creating high-end and traditional artwork. Initially working in advertising, followed by publishing industries with clients ranging from Porsche to British Airways, Intel, Williams Formula One, and HSBC. He traversed into film, specifically film costume, 26 years ago. His first work of recognition came with Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl, subsequently working on every film in the franchise to date, followed by further high-end features from Captain America, the First Avenger, Maleficent, Guardians of the Galaxy, Black Panther, Wonka, and the recently acclaimed Wicked, to name a few. To date, totaling some 56-plus international multi-million-dollar budget features to his name, he continues to push and believe in the communication that a hand-drawn image can convey. In addition to his film work, Darrel's own fine art paintings are exhibited widely internationally, whilst also being recognized and awarded for his excellence in watercolor. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce illustrator, concept artist Darrel Warner to the Designing Hollywood podcast show. Welcome, Darrel.
Thanks, Phil. Lovely to be here. Thank you for asking me. It's a real privilege.
Very excited to have you here. You have a career that spans multiple genres and a lot of different blockbuster hits. But the first thing that I want to talk to you about is, what was your aha moment, or what was the first time you were inspired to pursue a career in film or in television, entertainment?
I don't think, maybe there wasn't an aha moment for me. There was I guess there was a realization, because I was invited into it, Phil, in a way. It wasn't something on my agenda at all. I just, it was, when you look back at a career and the time I started out, you're very, in the 80s, I started working, I was very familiar with film and particularly the work of Drew Struzan, because that's paramount, as an artist, as an illustrator, you just looked at his work, you drooled over it. But I think the notion of actually being involved with film was way beyond my apprehension at that point in time. And it wasn't until 16 or 17 years into my career that I had the opportunity.
And how did you, once you started to kind of go into that process of being in film and kind of falling into it, did you find that it was an easy transition for you, or did you kind of were you trying to find your way? Did you know that it was something that you wanted to do longer? What was that process like for you?
Well, my background had always been figurative, so the actual that sort of segue into doing costume, for instance, quite naturally, because my background was portraiture, so I could draw very much kind of, I could capture likenesses really well. So, and that was championed by my first designer in Penny Rose, who recognised that. And I guess I learnt on the job. I had my first opportunity was a job that never got greenlit. It was an HBO project, and the beauty for me was it was 18 weeks worth of work, but I was in the studio at Pinewood here in the UK, and I just spent my time with the makers. So I just went from design team to maker to costume props to leather workers to jewelers, just to see all the processes and so I could understand where they were coming from, and that again was knowledge for me to be able to put on paper. So I think that was probably the transformative period in the realization that, okay, this is a really interesting job. This is a really interesting field to be involved in.
One of the things that I want to draw attention to our audience to when Darrel is talking is thinking about the fact that when you're in a position, especially when you're trying to learn on the job, right? There's so many different things. And in the costume department specifically, there's so many different craftsmen and artisans working in that department. And so what Darrel did is smart, which is he talked to them and he actually learned and he went through the process and he went through, the design team and through the department and started to figure out not only what everyone was doing, but also that helps inform illustrations. I also want to draw attention to the fact that illustration is not magic. It's a lot of hard work. And you can't draw what you don't understand. It's kind of
Exactly.
impossible. So Darrel was basically arming himself with the armor to basically, with the knowledge to be able to do his job. But inherently, I think that that's a big part about illustration anyway, especially conceptual, is like understanding what all the parts and pieces are, right?
Yeah, it's bringing something together and knowing how it works, how whether it's a functional piece of costume or it's an adornment, having that inside information and knowing how it's made is such a great boon for what we do. And I, even now, if I'm in a studio and I have kind of junior concept artists who
Mm-hmm.
generally speaking want to sit behind their computers, I'll say, come on, let's go and walk around the department, because I think it's really important that people understand what goes on. And also, there are so many fantastic artisans involved in the process of what we do. In getting a costume on screen, we play such a minor part in many ways, albeit an important part. It is pretty minor in the bigger picture. It's part of a process. But it's always a joy when you draw something, for instance, and that finds its way onto screen. I mean, for me, it's kind of rare now and again that you see a complete
Mm-hmm.
ensemble of what you've drawn, but you always see elements of what you've concepted, and
That's
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 one of the
that's good enough. Do you know what I mean?
well, that's one of my you've gotten to one of my questions. One of my questions was going to be, how do you feel when you see something that started on paper and you were illustrating it and see it fully realized into something standing in front of you or on screen?
Yeah, I mean that's always very special. I mean it still amazes me now as a massive thrill. But
Mm-hmm.
it's not. But it's the thrill of having conjured that image from your designer's head onto paper that then
Mm-hmm.
goes forward as a sort of form of blueprint that everybody subscribes to in
Yes.
the department. And I think that's such an important aspect of what is inherently what I feel the job should be about.
Yes.
Then to find it on screen is kind of that's kind of the icing on the cake.
Is there any particular costume or any time that you remember kind of like, I don't want to say phoning it in, but like where you were doing your job and then you saw the thing in front of you and you're like, man, that's cool. Like, or like, when it's like when you see the translation and you kind of realize how cool this job is.
Yeah, that's a tricky question though, isn't it?
Uh-huh.
Because where do we? I mean, I always see myself as a kind of a jobbing artist or jobbing illustrator. So I do it. You do it day in day out. And okay, some things you do and you think, okay, that's pretty interesting, or that's pretty cool. Most of the time, I'm never fully convinced about what I do, but it's it's a hand in hand scenario, I think. And if you have a designer who really gets what you're doing and you're delivering, their
Mm-hmm.
perceptions,
Mm-hmm.
you just it's going to be successful. And I will caveat that somewhat with possibly saying there's a massive difference for me, and I don't know if it's for you, Phil, but when you work with Oscar-winning designers,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying this is true across the board, but generally speaking, in my experience, they allow you so much more rope to go and hang yourself, in
Yes.
the knowledge that, of course, they're going to, you're going to generate a lot of really interesting concepts,
Yes.
which they can just cherry pick from. But then
I
that fulfills what we want to achieve. But of
correct.
course, it serves them well over and above what they normally possibly expect.
I find that what you're talking about right now is not only true, I find it to be something, um, it's a feeling that I really enjoy. The collaborators I've worked with, especially the ones that have won Oscars, are like, at the top of their game,
Yeah,
are usually the most confident in their
yeah,
abilities and in their crew. And I find them to be, I use this term often with some of them, as a creative amplifier. I find them to be people that understand the creative process so well against all the different mediums and against all the different crew and the people, the artisans they're working with. They trust them to deliver their best work.
exactly. And
um
that's the key word, trust.
yeah,
But
the
I think
trust.
we have to earn that trust. Though I think in some
Correct.
in some designers you never earn that trust because it's not because they don't want the trust. It's a case of I think their processes are very different. Right?
Correct.
So some designers are by rote, and I don't mean that in a dismissive way. It's just the way they
Yeah.
are, the way they operate.
Yes.
And for me, it's not. I'm probably not the best person for them to employ. In all honesty, and I think that actually, you might want to look at this person to be your illustrator.
Correct.
I don't mean that as in, like I said, I don't mean it to be
No, no,
dismissive.
no.
It's we look for avenues in our careers, and I guess we've both been fortunate that we've worked
Mhm.
with some fairly amazing people who have recognised what we bring to the design party, um, and I and that's important in terms of when you get to a certain pivotal point for me in my career that there are possibly designers that you get offered the job or projects where you might get offered the job and you think actually what is there in that for me, and I don't mean that from a selfish point of view, but as artists I think you want to be able to push the envelope a little bit more. So I think there are choices to be made. I don't think you have that choice when you're younger.
That's completely agreed.
When you're starting out, you have to serve your time before you have those opportunities, and before you get you attain that confidence from your designers.
I think so too, and it's something that I've said, and you said it perfectly here, which is you kind of, you sit down, you learn, you defer to, your costume designer or the artisans that have done it and have worked, and you learn. So you sit and you learn the department, you learn the things that are going on. I feel like I got more confident as I went on in my career to also then provide input, but it was like always if it was asked. So for me, it would be like, okay, what are we trying to do? And then I really would try within those first, like, even few days to really understand who my designer is, what their idiosyncrasies are, what their leanings are, what color palettes they like, what silhouettes, like what they gravitate towards. And that's
Yeah,
really just a people thing, which is just like, okay, who are you? What's your design aesthetic?
yeah,
What's your things? And then as it went on, as I had repeat business with different designers that I worked with over time, then once I knew those things, I also got the trust, which would be like, okay, I know Phil understands what I'm doing. And then it would be like, oh, that thing you did here reminds me of this. Have you seen this? And then it becomes this beautiful kind of play back and forth where you're like kind of a part of it. But I think that does come over time. And I think people looking at it sometimes from the outside in feel like it's like that's the way that it is. And you just get all of that up front, and it's not. So I
no,
definitely think it's something to do to work towards.
I think I came left field into the industry because I had
Mhm.
that painting and illustration background before. So certainly with Penny Rose, she because I'd known Penny for 10 years before she ever
Mhm.
invited me into film, if not longer. So she knew what I was about, knew what I could offer, knew what I. So I came in, and our first project was really Pirates of the Caribbean. That's a pretty high benchmark.
I mean, that's
So,
massive.
so, no, exactly. So on reflection, I didn't really think about it at the time. For me, the biggest
Right.
joy was the fact that I could just look at Howard Pyle and NC Wyeth's, work
Hmm.
body of works, because that was that was kind of our base uh, inspiration. And because I'd studied those artists when I was much young, as a student, it was joyous. So of course you just take it for granted, and that
Hmm.
the effervescence of youth, 20 or whenever, however long it was ago, you just get by on confidence. That it doesn't hit you too much later, thinking, Jesus, that was kind of quite, it was kind of quite a job to be involved in. And I guess the gravity of it hits you a little bit later, but you take it for
It
granted.
always comes later.
Yeah,
It always
exactly.
comes later.
Yeah,
I remember I think the first time I saw your work was either I got like an Art of Pirates book or
that's right. Yeah,
something. Yeah, that, and I don't think I'll forget it because I was already a fan of Penny Rose. So we should talk about Penny because I love her. I was a fan of her career and just watching things. And then I got like I remember being not like real upset, but upset because I remember it was like, she's amazing. And then I got the book and then I saw your illustrations. I was like, and her illustrations look like this. Like, I was like, it's too much good. Right. So let's talk about for a minute, let's fan out for Penny, but talk about your collaborations with Penny Rose, because I think that's a really good like benchmarking part of kind of the start of like your film career, but also just working with a master costume designer.
well, interesting. The great thing with Penny is because I'd known her for so long, because we were family
Hmm.
friends. So
Hmm.
we had that history already. So
Hmm.
there was never a question of trust,
Yes.
because obviously it's always quite tricky when you have a friendship that then becomes
Hmm.
a working relationship. So I could be quite, um, I could be quite cheeky with Penny. Trying to get away with it, because she's quite a fierce character, uh,
Hmm.
to work for, and she's pretty forthright in her opinions. But I think I was fortunate in that, because she was familiar with my work,
Hmm.
she would just give me stuff and then be absolutely amazed by it. Um, but she'd then come to me with a challenge, say, "Can you
Hmm.
do this group of characters? Can you do no, no, no," and leave me with this quandary: how to kind of bring this group of characters alive and how best to do it.
Right.
Now, knowing that, lots of, in terms of kind of, I don't know, narrative illustration, should we say, it's always set in an environment. But we weren't about that. Well, we're not about that. Oh, we were trying to sell costume. So I
Correct.
started doing these sort of what she called tableau illustrations, where you have all these characters, all interacting, telling a kind of a story arc, but you didn't know what that story arc was, but there was something going on within the image, and she loved that. And then that became like the new thing. And then she'd say, "Can you do like a color piece?" And she would always trust me with coming up with a new approach to selling her ideas in many ways. And of course, this is well before, I guess, the likes of Marvel and what Ryan Meinerding
Hmm.
and all those guys were doing.
Hmm.
Um, and um, it seemed relevant, but somehow still stuck in a period in time. Because it was still, because I work traditionally. I don't work
Yes.
on a computer.
Yes.
So there are certain restrictions with that, I guess, and sort of selling images.
Hmm.
We now in a time, we're in a period of time where everything is hyped. Illustration, the image is so hyped that I can't compete with you guys on computers, and so that's why I, kind of did a slightly shimmy to the left, and
Hmm.
thought, this, can I make this work?
Yes.
So Penny was that perfect vehicle for me to kind of experiment and push my personal ideas and how to sell costume in an
It
image.
the way that you traverse this, and also I think that one thing that you should be aware of, like as far as your community or your peers, is not only do we respect you a lot, but also we sometimes, I like, for me, I know I get jealous because I don't want to render all the time and do these like hyper realistic things. I prefer classic illustration. And so to see the skill set fully on display all the time and
Mm.
competing, it does compete. I think you're wrong there. It does compete because it's so striking when you see a real illustration and see the skill set of like the hand and watercolor and all of those different things. I think it does compete because we're so used to now seeing like photographs and all of these different
Sure.
things, but
Yeah.
it speaks to the craft of costume illustration or costume design, right? Which is like that
Yeah.
hand kind of
Yeah.
in there doing it, and then like maybe it doesn't come out exactly like the illustration. That's the point, but the initial feeling of it to sell, it does the exact same thing, if
No,
not sometimes better, you know?
it's ultimately, we're all looking for a language,
Hmm.
the visual language to sell ideas. And I guess now through those experiences with Penny, that gave me a period of time, a number of years, because I worked on so many projects with her. I mean, I didn't
Hmm.
work with any other designer for years,
Yes.
so I was very much able to hone that language, um, which she embraced and pushed, and pushed me.
Hmm.
So that was, I've got a lot to thank Penny for in so many ways. It's, I just, I would love to have, for her to have won something with the Pirates. Do you know what I mean? Because I
Yes.
think they're such special projects. And it's you almost sense that time has passed, but hey ho, who knows? But
I still agree with you, specifically because I think with pieces like that, especially because it's such a massive tentpole kind of like project, I think the tendency for people too is to look at it and accept it as it is, not realizing like when you're watching this thing, it's like, hey, this is all custom. These pirates, they didn't go to the pirate store and shop
no,
for pirates. Like it's all custom, right down to the fabric she did for the scarf, or what
yeah,
she's looking for this little piece of jewelry or this little knickknack or whatever it is. All of those things have to be created, and so it's a massive bit of world building and character and storytelling, through costume design.
yeah,
And so I agree with you. Though there's so much richness, and I employ all of you guys watching at home or listening at home to go back and watch those films just under the eye of watching costume and looking at the sheer amount of work that had to be created to do those movies. Even just one of them, just watching one of them. But if you
yeah.
watch all of them,
Watch the first one. I mean,
yeah.
I recall, we, particularly with Barbosa,
Hmm.
who's quite a flamboyant character. So a
Hmm.
lot of that frock coat he was wearing was a beautiful garment. And then Penny said, "No, we're just gonna, we're gonna break the shit out of that. We're gonna, so we
Hmm.
put it in a cement mixer, all that stuff. Just chuck crap in there, and lo and behold, it turned out, look, the thing is, she loves things that look lived in, and that
Hmm.
was part
Hmm.
of my brief. Just make it look really knackered, make it look, as if they've never stepped out of it. They've always had it on their back. So that was, again, that's a very useful lesson to learn.
It is. I think especially because that's another part of the costume department that is kind of like the unsung hero, is like when you think about aging and dying and
Yeah,
like the kind of the craft it takes to make something look like, not like a costume. It is a costume, it's something that looks lived in and worn and real, right? The grounding of the costume happens in that process. And I think that the first time I really noticed aging and dying is when I worked with Jeffrey Curlin on Inception, and there was a team there. It was Jack Taggart. Um, I can't remember who else was on that project, but I just remember watching them do stuff like, they were dremeling the edges of the shoes to make sure they looked like they were, cuffed, and like they were folding them with a rubber band to make sure that they got the little crease in there, and throwing. They had cut up, what is it? Cut up car mats because of the tread, they had cut them up into pieces and then put those in the dryer and then put the clothes in there. Same thing, kind of like a cement mixer, where it's like going through and it's pummeling the things and like just all these things. And of course, then, over dyeing things and doing little stitch marks and all kinds of stuff. So it's really interesting to see that process and to then tell the audience that that's like one job all to itself, along
Yes.
with all the other things, right? So there's so much to specialty costume in general. And the costume illustration part is like that first initial stab at what this thing could look like or what it could be.
Absolutely.
When let me see, let me ask you one other thing about working, because you brought them up. Well, first, there's a couple of things because there's so much here, richness here. I want to draw attention to, you had brought up Drew Struzan,
Yep.
who's a big inspiration and a hero for all of us in the art community, who is currently battling Alzheimer's, which we saw. So just a big shout out to Drew Struzan and his family. Masterful craftsman and artist and draftsman. I think he inspired a lot of us, all of the posters he did for years, and just wanting to draw and be proficient and good at it, right?
Yes.
Are there any other illustrators that for you, like where you studied their work, like just coming up, because you've named a couple, but like some that really had like a profound effect on your process?
I mean, there are quite a few, but it's across centuries, Phil. I mean, you can take, I don't know, Velázquez or Dürer or Holbein.
Mm-hmm.
So because they, as portrait artists, certainly for me, John Everett Millais, who's a pre-Raphaelite in the UK, that whole movement, that pre-Raphaelite movement, and up until kind of Silver Age, well, Golden Age and Silver Age American illustration, as I say, Pyle before N.C. Wyeth. I mean, Andrew Wyeth is a big inspiration for me. Norman Rockwell is a great benchmark.
Amazing.
Then you get to people like Bernie Fuchs, Robert
Mm-hmm.
Heindel, David Grove, all those guys.
Okay.
I just devoured them. Because it's before the internet, so you had to buy Society of Illustrators annuals, and you just devoured those annuals every year whenever they came out.
Correct.
Pour over those pages, look for those big names. So yeah, it's. I mean, I've never veered towards fashion illustrators,
Mm-hmm.
not because I'm familiar with them, but it's never for me been the crux of what I have sought or been about.
Yes.
If that makes sense. Much of my, I'm born out of a reality, the reality of the figure, and wanting to capture that. So that's really my mindset, should we say.
I'm in the agreement with you too. I think I didn't learn fashion or any of that stuff until I was actually doing costume illustration. So for me, I was looking at illustrators similar like Rockwell and Leyendecker and I always say his name wrong. I think it's Arthur Rackham or
Arthur Rackham. Yeah.
Arthur Rackham.
Yeah.
And then just people that draw really, Peter DeSev, like people that just draw really, really well. And looking at that, and then like even like people that kind of elongate it, like Egon Schiele.
Yeah.
So I remember just looking at stuff like that, but not really having a handle on fashion illustration until I got into costume. Then I was looking at like Rene Grau and stuff like that, and like all these different illustrators and people that just drew really well. And so, like Theodora Van Runkel, her illustrations, her costume illustrations are amazing. So I started to look at it that way, but I didn't learn anything until I actually got into it. So I had just a profound, or like I had a inclination to draw people. So I knew I liked drawing people, and then it was like, oh, and then costume kind of allows me to do that. So I understand that thing, but then you kind of build as you go along. So for anybody listening out there too, it's important to note that you can get in there and kind of learn on the job, but it's up to you to also take in new information and then seek out like, what's around you.
I would say go further than that, Phil, and say life is as a constant education.
Yes, completely.
There's always something new coming up, always a new artist, always worth looking at something, whether it's somebody with a new style, a new take on something, I think it's endless. I think you just have to be open, constantly open to being not necessarily influenced, but acknowledging, those changing voices, shall we say?
And
Illustration
then
illustration today, for instance, has changed dramatically from when I started out on it.
so much. Yeah.
You know, um,
It felt like for me it was changing as I was doing it was even more frustrating. I felt like as, I got used to, first kind of drawing on paper, then watercolor, then gouache and acrylic and oil, like learning all the basics. And then all of a sudden there was digital thrown in there and you're like, what? And then it was like a frustrating because it came right at the end of my kind of college career. So then it turned from all of this stuff that I had been building and learning, then it was like trying to get this digital thing to do the things that I could do with my hands, which was frustrating.
yeah.
And then from there, I was like, okay, now I can do that. So now I'm learning to do that. And then it's like, oh, now we're using photographs. And you're like, wait, what? And then so now it's like, okay, let me try to do that. And then you finally get that down. And it's like, now we're doing 3D. And you're like, oh my God, it needs to stop.
You can keep it, Phil.
Yeah. It was just at every given point, I was like, I got it. And then they're like, oh, yeah, we're not doing that anymore. Now we're doing this other thing. And I was like, man.
The one thing that really amazes me is that it's. I mean, I don't know. Because my trade is so simple in so
Yes.
many ways. Because it's just I'm dealing with physical things, whereas
Yes.
you guys, it's a constantly. Oh, what program we're using now? Oh, we need to do this, or it's Blender, or it's just a
Uh-huh.
you know, constant learning of new programs.
And
Um,
guess what we're doing now? Now with AI and everything else that's going on, we're all coming back to what? Traditional. We're all
yeah, well,
trying to go back to like, can we just draw on paper? Is that
yeah,
possible?
honestly,
So I feel like it's a renaissance,
yeah. Let's hope so. Let's hope so for.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
hope so. Well, first, before we move forward, I do want to ask this question just because it's something we've talked about it a little bit, but just define your process. What mediums do you use on a traditional, like on a standard basis? Like what's your main process that you're kind of,
So,
utilizing?
I'll say this. So, if somebody had asked me 40 years ago when I started out, 40 odd years ago when I started, illustrating, that after 20 years I'd be in film, and then 75% of my time would be spent drawing alone
Hmm.
to make a
Hmm.
living. I'd have thought, well, you're mad. Of course not. But that is the
Hmm.
truth. You know, um, so essentially, I'm just using a technical pencil with a
Hmm.
4B lead in it. So
Okay.
I don't kind of mess about with having the sharpened pencils. It's for me that's time wasted. I much rather
Yes.
just purely just drawing. And okay, a
Yes.
technical pencil doesn't necessarily give you a massive kind of the massive ability to put down areas of tone. So it does take time, but it does give you
Hmm.
the facility to draw really quite quickly and quite fluidly. So that's my main medium, and then watercolor. I tend to, from those working drawings, I will
Hmm.
then, once something's approved, I'd kind of adopt a couple of different watercolor techniques in many ways, depending on depending on how I feel or how I think the image should or would appeal, shall we say. So some are really highly rendered and will take 5 to 10 days, but that's
Hmm.
all dancing, super, super kind of realistic. And others might just take a day to do. But just
Yes.
so some are very loose, so, some are kind of just like working watercolors. Again, it depends on the client, depends on my designer. So, and it's just very straightforward. And I have a very strict palette with watercolor. I use the same. I never veer beyond, kind of 10 colors. And
Okay.
so simply because with experience, exactly how that palette works.
Hmm. I will say you're skipping over a lot of it. A lot of this is so much trial and error, but also just skill set from just doing and learning and
Exactly.
growing.
Yeah.
I foolishly tried to go back and I was like, you know what? I used to really be good at watercolor. And I tried to just sit down and just do it. What a disaster. Because I've been doing digital for so long, I'd forgotten like so many little things. Like when
Yeah.
you go to paint and, I had a color that was too dark and it's bleeding and just expanding and I'm panicking because I'm used to just pressing buttons, and I'm like, what do I do? And I'm like, oh yeah, I need clean water, and then like all the things, right? But it's so funny to just watch it be this thing that like really, and then it makes you appreciate people that are good at it because it's such a skill. Like it is such an actual skill to do it. So kudos to you for that, and then also just kind of doubling down on it, and also you've gotten, relatively for what I know, very like fast at it in terms of being able because of the
Yeah.
proficiency of it.
Exactly. No,
Um,
exactly, and that's much to do with technique and knowing that palette
mhm,
and what it offers you. Um, I mean, I think going back to what you just said there, in terms of doing the washes and so on
mhm.
and controlling it, no, you don't have an undo, the undo button.
No.
So it's a really, 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 really disciplined approach. So you have to be really clear in your mind exactly where you want that image to be going,
Yeah.
before you even put any color down.
I
So
I completely panicked and rage quit. I'm not gonna lie about it. I was like, "Oh, this is gonna require me to actually do this a lot more often," because I thought I could just pick it back up, but it's been
yeah,
years.
it's a tricky technique. If you're not doing it every day, it is a tricky technique.
It
And I
becomes
think,
tricky. One of our peers, Oksana, Oksana is also just a really great watercolor painter, and she had been doing it even in college. And we often laugh now because she challenged me. She's like, "Oh, you should maybe try gouache again." And I was like, "But we call it gouache because we didn't know how to say it when we were in college. We were like gouache," and she's like gouache. So we were trying gouache, and I was like, and then I remembered, I was like, "Oh, I don't know how to mix gouache anymore. I'm mixing it too thin, like it's coming out like watercolor." And so I was just like, this is a mess. I'm just going to go back to my computer and my buttons because I can't do this. Um, let's transition. I want to transition now because you obviously have worked on a bunch of projects, and we've talked about some of them. But one of the ones, a joy of the last, year and a half, 2 years was Wicked. So talk about how you got involved with Wicked.
well, I think it was serendipity in many ways. I'm very fortunate
Hmm.
because obviously you guys are already working on it. I had been offered two other jobs, Phil. I turned
Okay.
Wicked. I turned Wicked down to begin with.
Ah.
Not because how we work. We get called and we get
Hmm.
penciled, and
Hmm.
out of I mean, I tend to be very honest. And so when somebody phones me and say, "Are you available and can we book you?" and you
Hmm.
agree your rate, you say, "Yeah." So there's a heavy pencil, and then it's like a linear thing. So they have first shout, second shout. Wicked. I'd already had these two jobs that I'd been offered, but hadn't agreed to either.
Okay.
And then one of them did my deal, so I took the job. And then Wicked phoned like 2 days later, and I had to say, "I'm sorry, I can't do it. I've already just taken a job." So I
Hmm.
turned it down. Uh, I went and did that job.
Hmm.
2 weeks in, my designer got fired.
Oh my gosh.
So in the normal run of things, for me, as an honorary thing, you step away with your designer, which is
Yes.
what I kind of did. So I said, "Okay, well, maybe I'm going to step away here." So I thought, I don't really necessarily have a choice. Maybe should I? And I thought, no, I can't stay on. Like because there's the designer that got fired, who's got released,
Hmm.
is my designer. So therefore, I'm going to step away. So I phoned the supervisor back up on Wicked, not thinking for a moment that there'd be an opportunity because I thought, it's kind of 2 weeks have passed. They'll have found somebody.
Right.
I knew that you guys were already on it, so
Hmm.
it's like kind of there was a slight mystery to it, and I didn't know anything more than that. So I phoned the supervisor up, Dulcie Scott, and I said, "Oh, Dulcie," and I've worked with Dulcie years and years and years ago, 20 odd years ago, and I said,
Yeah.
"Look, I'm really sorry. I don't want to mess you back, but my job has kind of gone down, or my design has been released, so therefore I'm kind of on the market again. I don't have to be, but you know."
Hmm.
It doesn't make sense that I stay on. She said, "We'll have you."
Yep.
And I said, "Okay, so do you want to know my rate? Doesn't matter. We'll have you."
Well,
I
you're here.
I
Let's
I
go.
said, "Okay, okay." So I then gave notice,
Hmm.
but for me, the opportunity, it was 6 weeks down the line before Paul Daswell was going to be coming over, or
Yes.
before I could start on the project. And I said, well, okay, well, look, that's fine. Thinking, oh my God, I got a 6 week period. But I went back into the job I was on and said, look, I am going to step away, but I am still available. I have taken another job. I've got a 6 week window. And they said, well, we'll keep you on. So it was perfect. So, I kind of transitioned from one straight into working with Paul, but then it was remote because you were still on it. And I think it was just at that period where because it was originally going to be filmed in Atlanta, wasn't it?
I think that they had talked about it, but I feel like they kind of knew that they were going over. So from my understanding, it never really was here. They were
Okay.
kind of teetering on knowing that they were going to be in London, and so it was just a matter of kind of getting Paul started and
Okay.
looking at his initial kind of inspirations and thought processes so that the studio could see what he wanted, like what his vision was,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
Then when they went over to the UK, they needed a team, and so they were like,
Yeah.
it's kind of
Yeah.
like a Passover.
Yeah. And it's one of those
Yeah.
things because then I saw all your work, 9B's work on the
Hmm.
project. Paul obviously shared that with me, and I thought, oh my God, a lot of stuff has already been done. So I wasn't sure. It's that thing about getting in your designer's head.
Hmm.
What Paul wanted, what the expectation was. And of course, it was a very much a kind of try and see, and we were working
Hmm.
remotely at the time because he was in New York. So I just started drawing, and I think we'd have Zoom meetings every 2 or 3 days, and you just start to build up this conversation, this language, and understanding the vocabulary of what Paul required. And so when he came over, when he
Hmm.
arrived, and I think in the June, we kind of hit the ground running in many ways, and we were at Elstree in North London, so
Okay.
in a studio. As a small design team to start off with, but it ramped up pretty quickly. So, but Paul's obviously, you know how he works. He's very clear. He's got an absolute vision of what he wants to achieve. And I was just honoured to be able to facilitate that, really. So and try and bring, I don't know, some grace to it. Not that it really needed it, but it's, through watercolor.
Hmm.
And I think the great thing is Paul recognized that he loved it because he works in watercolor as well. So
Correct.
it was kind of kindred spirits in many ways, shall we say?
While we're talking about Paul, let's talk about what it was like to collaborate with Paul. Because I think that the working relationship is really important with designers, and specifically with Paul and Wicked. He's such a great collaborator. So just talk about how you guys will work together.
Well, it was quite amusing to begin with because you, I, there's that sort of slight nervousness, isn't it, when you start with a new
Hmm.
designer as to how much can you bug them, how much
Yes.
can you be treading on their toes. Um, he had an office, and I was kind of just around the corner, um, and if I had a question, I'd just go in, but
Hmm.
I just stick my head around the corner, and he kind of look up. You could almost see like his eyes rolled, like, okay, what, either, but it
What's
wasn't.
going on? Yeah.
It wasn't
Yeah.
but I just wanted, because I like to know exactly the thought process in terms of why is this like this? Why
Hmm.
do you want this like this? Why? Not that I'm questioning his design. What I'm saying is, I need to know: does it sit on this part of the body, or is it doing this? You know.
Hmm.
So I just wanted to clarify. So we bu- we built up a relationship in that way. So that's how I kind of we very much he began to very much trust in my input and kind of got where I was coming from. So therefore, I think it's very tricky for him because coming to the UK, completely new team,
Hmm.
um, lots of stuff to take on board. Um, and being thrust having a group of illustrators. I was kind of the forefront of that, being thrust upon
Hmm.
you. Say here you are. Here's your group of guys you're going to be working with. Not necessarily his choice, but they came to me and said, can you facilitate a team of people? And I
Yes.
said, yeah, I'll try and find a group that will work together. Um, so I guess maybe 2 or 3 months into the project, we had a pretty solid group of illustrators who could just, really work through, all of Paul's ideas, whether it be from the Munchkins, and it was just detailing stuff, Phil, because like I say, you guys have done a lot of the groundwork on it, a lot of the legwork. We were just really starting to refine things a lot more. That's all.
I think that, but you know what? There's something to that because I feel like what ended up happening, which was the one of the more beautiful things that I saw is between the two kind of illustration departments, right? In terms of like, over here versus over there. What I found is that you guys really found the heart of what the project ended up being. And so it was like, I feel like it was more like we did, it's like broad strokes, right? So there's some stuff
Yeah,
that was
sure.
done, but then there's other things where it's just like, okay, what this feels this way, but what is it actually? And I
Yeah.
feel like that's where the illustration kind of came to life there. And then also just like there are things that formed, like we were talking about the that mathematics spiral,
Yeah.
that everything like so that concept came when you guys were there with the production designer with Nathan, and then that kind of turned everything in this really kind of beautiful way where everything kind of formed itself around like a conceptual idea. Were there any other things that you felt that were like that, where there was like some kind of like pinpoint or something where you kind of really focused on it and it kind of helped your overall process?
I mean, not necessarily. I think that you've hit the nail on the head when you
Yeah,
said, it was a very collaborative process. Where you
yeah.
had so many different artisans all on the same page, and that made a huge difference. No department was fighting others like you often get. You sometimes you get production designers who are a bit grounder. They want the environments to be all singing, all dancing, and that don't necessarily talk to the costume designer because,
Hmm.
well, I'm not worried about your palette. You get a sense of on some projects that happens. Wicked was never that case, and I think much of that's to do with those HOPs and also John Chu. That has such clarity, and I think also Paul had such a focus on what he wanted to achieve through those characters. That was paramount to the
Hmm.
success, I think. And all I mean, I said here's the thing. I said to Paul, I mean, I've worked on projects where I felt the design was really, really strong, and I felt that the costume designers should win an Oscar.
Hmm.
When I left the project, I said to Paul, "I'll see you at the Oscars."
Yes.
No,
Yes.
no question,
Period.
no
Yeah.
question. Right? But all the way through, you just sense that. So, and that's rare for me. That's quite, that's a rare commodity to witness.
Yeah, like
Kind of
to and to witness it in real time and to
yeah,
actually see it.
yeah. And then
Um,
that made it the joy, Phil, to work on. Because you knew
yes,
you were working on something special.
you could feel it the whole time. I think also too, one of the things that you said for a shout out to Paul, which is he's very particular in the sense that he always comes to something with a point of view, or he kind of knows what he wants, but then he also allows everyone to help him find it.
Yes.
And I think that that part of it was such a joy to kind of be there and know like, okay, I want this to feel this way, and he'd even draw it out, which is another thing that was really fun, is to have a designer that can draw,
Mm,
like where you
yeah,
draw something and he gives you drawn back notes and he says, oh, like this, or this spirals this way, or this goes from this
yeah,
pinpoint. So that was really helpful. But to have where it's like, I kind of know this particular thing, but also to not feel afraid to be like, oh, because you said this, what about this? And it's like, yeah. And then it just was such a nice creative process. And the other thing was just kind of like that feeling of not feeling as though the pressure of doing this big project would facilitate or overshadow kind of the emotions of doing it and working with people. I never felt stifled or never felt upset
no,
or angry. Like it just felt it
no,
was just a joy to come to
yeah.
work.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, and I think everybody felt the same. As I said before, everybody's on the same page. Everybody's moving the same direction, um, and the great thing, for Paul, I think it was a really big eye opener for him in terms of having those
Hmm.
artisans as well. Bringing something new to him every day. So questioning, what do you think of this? how do you see this? And then for him to look at that and say, oh, let's try this, or can we push this area, or can we?
Mhm.
So so it was, and I think he said, I mean, he's been very, very graceful in his kind of acknowledgement of everybody
Mhm.
over here in the UK. I mean, I don't think. I mean, I've worked with some exceptionally amazing artisans in costume over the years, but I think that's certainly on Wicked, that bringing together that group of people will never be repeated.
Correct. Correct.
Not
You could feel it.
I don't think in my lifetime. You know,
You could feel it because you said this beautifully before. It was literally often you'll find productions where there's some kind of something getting in the way of the departments working together, right? There's either one ego or this or that or whatever it is. But when it's right, it's really right. And then what's good about it is the work shows up on screen. Like you can
yeah,
tell that Paul worked well with Nathan and that they all worked well with John. Like, and then all the actors, like you can tell that everyone was working together, understanding that they were crafting an entire piece, right? It's not little pieces or one piece is more important than the other. If it was a band or a choir, they were all listening to each other and singing and making sure that they sound good, and no one part is more important than the other. And I just think that that's a really beautiful testament to that
yeah,
project.
yeah.
And you're right; it rarely happens in that way to where it's kind of
Well,
cohesive in that way.
I can count it on one hand. I can say there are three jobs that I've worked on where they've had similar. So the first Pirates, without a shadow of a
Hmm.
doubt. The first Guardians of the Galaxy,
Hmm.
and then Wicked. You
Love
know,
that, and
they're probably the three. I mean, what's ironic is they're very different genres. However,
they are.
uh, but that's again, that comes back to the joy of what we do as concept artists. And the projects
Do
we
you
get
have
involved.
a favorite genre?
No, I don't. Well, I don't
Just
do contemporary. I don't do contemporary. I don't do today
okay,
because
okay,
there's nothing. There's nothing.
yeah.
In many ways, there's nothing for me there. Shall we say? I don't mean that in a dismissive way, but
No, completely.
if it's a Prada suit, it's a Prada suit. Nothing for
Yes.
me to do.
Other
Yeah,
than just to illustrate a
I'll
dude,
paint
but
it.
it's like it is what it is.
I'll paint it for you, but you're
Yes.
wasting money. Yeah.
Was
So,
there anything speaking of that, because that's not a challenge, was there anything that was challenging for you, like on Wicked specifically, that took you out of your comfort zone, or just like a challenging costume to illustrate or draw?
we had the and this is towards the end of my time on the project. So we had when they go to the Emerald City, one what's it called, one not one fine day, but that's the song when they arrive on the train, and
When they arrive on the train.
yeah, and you've got that big musical number.
Hmm.
So that's a very heavily populated scene or sequence that came towards the end of the schedule of filming, and there's a lot of costume. So Paul kind of pretty much, I mean, he was pretty exhausted, I think, by then.
Hmm.
But the great thing is that he had ideas for certain characters, but not all the characters. So just as long as we had this vernacular language by then, of course, we
Right.
knew exactly what. So we had to kind of there were bartenders, there were waiters, there were hairdressers, there were I mean, a whole cacophony of trades that had to subscribe to the Emerald City look.
Hmm.
So that was quite a challenge because we're on a really, really tight schedule at that point in time, and obviously, to get them fabricated. I mean, it's not much more than I can remember. I mean, if I said it was a month, but I'm probably not too far wrong.
It's
But
also the opposite of what normally happens. Like you'll spend time doing costumes that don't see the light of day. Like they're there for 2 seconds. That sequence showed so many
yeah,
costumes. It like I mean, and like it really like to John's credit in terms of like world building and looking at it, like when they went there, you see everything. You saw the hairdressers and all the bar, you saw all of them. and they
Yeah.
all got their little moment to shine. And so gratefully they were there, but that, like, knowing the time frame and the crunch that you guys were under, and then also just the creativity to be able to think about what would this look like.
And
You
also,
know
for,
what?
it throw into the mix the homage to the original cast of Wicked, the Broadway,
Correct.
you know,
Yes. Oh, right. Yes.
and then also, um, the original writer and Woody, all those characters being either they were thrown kind of in the mix very late
Yeah.
on,
Like, yeah. Yeah.
um, but
With elaborate costumes, I might add.
exactly,
Their
exactly. But
costumes were
then, but
not
then
simple.
it was all, it was kind of, that was a bit of a head, kind of messing up sort of period. But it was kind of, we just kind of got on with it. But that was again, it was just a joy. And also to, by then you've really got the trust of your design. Paul, you just say, what do you think of this? He said, yeah, that's great. Sign
Hmm.
off. So
Sign off and let's get it done. Yeah. And then I guess lastly, is there anything, I think because we're gonna have part two coming out. Uh was there any, like, is there anything, not, give no spoilers, but is there anything particular that you feel like you're looking forward to, and of seeing more of?
yeah, I think Alphabet will be interesting.
Yes. Agreed. Yeah, I don't want to give away too much, but I know that there's stuff coming up.
That's all I'm saying.
I'm hoping too that we get to see. I think we do, but I think we get to see a little bit more of Munchkinland, or more of the Munchkins, and more things like
Yeah.
that. So, like, there's a few things that we'll get to see that that we saw in the first one, but we'll get to dive into them a little bit more.
Yeah, I felt that we didn't see enough of Munchkinland in the first and second.
Yes, completely. It was there, but it's not really there. So I'm hoping that it's a lot more in the
I mean,
second one.
and that's the thing you don't realize. There was a lot of amazing costuming in that
Hmm.
world that
Hmm.
hasn't come to the fore yet, I don't think.
Agreed. And then I guess what do you have, or what's up next for you? What do you have coming up?
Well, I'm on a Sam Mendes thing at the moment,
Okay.
which is about four famous Liverpudlians. So I'm not saying too much more than that.
Yeah,
But
no, but just
yeah.
enough, yes.
So that's been
Um,
good. That's been good fun. It's a new designer to me, Sinead Cadeo, who is really lovely. Really enjoying it. And then thereafter, yeah, and I mean, I mean, who knows? I don't know at this point in time. I mean, I'll just wait and see what turns up, if anything turns up. I mean, it's been such a bizarre period of time, through
correct.
COVID until now. I don't count my chickens. So
Is there I've always wanted to ask you this because you've worked on so many fantasy things and everything. Is there a dream project, that, like, something that you've always wanted to do that hasn't come up, or you feel like you would love to do it if the opportunity arose?
not that I can think of.
Yeah.
Um, I think I always look at projects just on their own merit when they turn up. I mean, sometimes we don't get a choice. I mean, it's kind of,
Correct.
if you're free, and then you might. Well, I mean, Wicked and those other two projects before is a typical scenario. No work for a little while, then three buses come along at once. You know,
Yes.
it's always tricky. But I mean, I have other things in terms of personal painting that I do. So if no job comes along, I mean, I've got a fairly this is quite apart from costume. I mean, I've got a fairly major one-man show next year. So that
That's
aside,
amazing.
I'm working towards that. So,
What's your personal work like? Or what do you like to paint, just for yourself?
well, well, this is going to sound quite bizarre, but during COVID, um,
Hmm.
when we had all the time in the world,
Hmm.
I found a dead bird walking the dog, being struck by a
Mm.
car. It's only a thrush. It's a very simple bird, garden bird, song thrush, but it was such a beautiful thing. I didn't really
Hmm.
want to cast it aside. I didn't want to throw it in the ditch. And I thought, oh, well, I've got time. I'll just take it home and paint it. So that's what I did. And,
Wow.
and that's become a little bit of a kind of a springboard to other things, Phil. So I did a painting in 2022 of a dead
Mm-hmm.
barn owl called Crew, and it was my father found it, and he phoned me up and said he found this barn owl hit by a truck, and
Mm-hmm.
I just said to him, what position did you find it in? He said, well, it was a kind of a semi-cruciform position. I had a notebook and I just like a little drawing
You wrote it down, yeah, yeah.
in a kind of a crucifixion shape. And then I wrote the word pink. I don't know why I wrote pink, but I wrote the
Mm-hmm.
word pink. Anyway, and then when I got hold of the bird, generally speaking, they get put in the freezer, so
Mm-hmm.
you can't get them. And then I got hold of it and I did a painting of it, a watercolor of it, and I did a pink background on it. So that painting then went to the Royal Institute of Painters in Watercolor annual exhibition here at the Mile Galleries in
Mm-hmm.
2023 and won the award for excellence, which is kind of a bit
That's
of
amazing.
a deal, in terms of, for me, it's a deal because the society was started, or the institute was started by William Turner.
Mm-hmm.
So it has this massive heritage. So that was a for me is a kind of a blast. But then that painting, I entered it in for a competition in the States called Birds in Art, which is in Wisconsin.
Okay.
And it got accepted there. Then I went on a 2-year tour of the States to all various museums. Came back in January. I entered it in for another competition in the States at the New Salem Museum of Art, which is in Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm.
It's worth looking up. It was an amazing new museum.
Okay.
And it's been accepted there. It's the only watercolor.
That's amazing.
So I've just shipped it back. So I fly out in 2 weeks' time for the private view of that. So as an aside from the costume work, there's this other thing going on. But they're all I mean I tend to celebrate things that are deceased, primarily birds, in
Mm-hmm.
order to make them sing again. So there's some sort of poetic,
It's
kind of,
very poetic and also very awesome. And now I'm completely intrigued by this. The fact that, too, I think that I like that you have an outlet, like your art is just life in general, and you have ways of showing it, and it's not just entertainment based.
no, exactly.
Um,
And I think it's important to have that balance.
yes,
I mean,
that's one thing that you're inspiring me because I think that one thing that happened is for years I got so used to doing production art, I very seldom get to paint and draw for
yeah,
myself. And I think for all artists, it's important to do that, even if it's just something frivolous, so that you get your own ideas out, you
yeah,
foster your creativity, and it's something that you don't notice you need until you do it again, and then you're like, oh, I should do this more often. Like I need this. It's an actual thing,
yeah.
as opposed to just pumping out artwork like execute, execute, execute. Just something that could be frivolous, that can be silly, that can be bad, it can be good. It's just
Yeah.
for you, you know?
Don't let it sit on the back boiler. Just
Yes,
don't, just go and do it. Doesn't matter how good, bad, or indifferent it is. Just go and do it
just
because
do it.
you exercise that the artistic need that we have, and I think that's really really critical.
I want to thank you, Darrel. We are out of time, but you've given us a lot to chew on. And I also want people to be able to follow you or look up your work. So, can you give your social medias or websites or anything that you want
Yeah,
for
well,
people
I
to
mean,
look you up?
social media is just Instagram. I only do
Hmm.
Instagram. I don't do anything else. So it's just
Okay.
Darrel J Warner,
Okay.
Darrel, Darrel, not Darryl, Darrel J Warner. And then you can just if you punch that into Google, you'll find my website, just darrelwarner.co.uk. Um, which I mean, I haven't updated it for a while with all the AI stuff going on. I just haven't bothered. Just so it's I just leave that alone.
Really, really quick, even though this is a complete trap, what's your feeling on AI?
I'm not. I mean, I loathe it. I think it will just find its way into our business. I mean, it already has. I mean, it's in our business. I mean, it's inevitable. But I think ultimately, Phil, it comes down to intelligence, and then how we conduct ourselves and how we want to be seen. I mean,
Yes,
if I put it this way, if I can compete on a level playing ground with you guys at computers, it means that we all can.
correct.
Irrespective of how good, bad, or indifferent we are, But it is a level playing ground. An AI will just it's just I sense it will get its hook into various aspects of the entertainment industries, But I don't think it's the be all and end all by any stretch of the imagination.
Agreed.
I,
I've been outspoken about it to say that what we all do here and what this podcast really is about, even just in terms of talking to you over the course of this hour, has been about design process. And AI skips design process.
Yeah.
So if you know anything about your product, like film, television, entertainment is all about storytelling, but ultimately storytelling is a product of design process. So if you skip design process, you're going to have problems, and inherently you don't know your product. So
and also, Phil, let's least we forget it's about communication.
Correct. It's about
If
communication.
If we don't have communication, we have nothing.
Correct. I also think that there's a skill set there, and I don't want to skip it. So I'm very glad that you have your approach and your opinions about it. For me, it's been that kind of thing. Not wanting to skip design process. The art of it is there, and then also just the idea of people saying that AI is democratizing art, and it's like it doesn't need to be democratized. If you want to pick up a pen and paper, it's always available to you. If you want to draw, it's not gatekept. It's literally something anyone can do at any point. And so if you really want that, go after it and learn how to do it. Really do it.
Enjoy it.
And enjoy it. It's an actual joy. It's a process not to be skipped. So I'll leave the audience there. I want to thank Darrel for coming. I also want to thank our sponsor, the Universal Costume Department and Universal Backlot. I want to thank founder and executive producer Martika Ibarra and co-founder, costume designer Marilyn Vance, and thank all of our viewers for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and tune in wherever you listen to your podcast. I'm Phillip Boutté. I'm your host. And until next time, thank you so much. And thanks to Darrel.
Thank you very much, Phil. It's been an honor.